Hello and welcome to my channel, and also Happy New Year to all of my viewers. Today we're going to have a look at this drawing of a sleepy bear done in charcoal. But before I get on with the drawing process, I just want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already, and you can also click the notification icon or the bell icon so that you can make sure that you never miss any of my videos. Anyway, as you can see, I'm doing the sketch with a graphite pencil before I move on with charcoal. I am working on a 9 times 12 inches size paper, so the usual size that I work on. And I'm going to be working mostly with woodless charcoal pencils and vine charcoal. So these are going to be my main drawing tools, but as usual I did the sketch with a graphite pencil. And now I'm starting with the ears. I like to start with the ears for some reason when I draw animals. They are one of the most prominent parts on an animal's body. And you can see how I'm drawing the fur, laying down some initial strokes, trying to imitate the structure and the texture of the fur. But these are just some of the initial strokes, some of the initial edges or lines. All of this will be blended later, and a lot more layers will be added to it. So I'm just working on some of the darker areas, like for example around the head, around the snout, and this shadow area around the body to the left. But there are always a couple of things that I need to remind you of when drawing fur, and there's going to be a lot of that in this video, obviously, because I'm drawing a large sleepy bear. Whenever you're drawing fur, you need to try to remember a couple of important things. First, you need to make sure that the length of your strokes, your pencil strokes, roughly matches the length of the fur that you see in your reference photos. And also you need to try to make sure that the direction of your strokes also matches the reference photo, or the way the fur grows on the animal's body. Why is this important if we're going to be blending anyway? Well, because when you use brushes, even when you go over those pencil strokes and you start blending, a lot of those strokes will still remain visible and that texture will still be there. So it's very important to lay down the groundwork so that it will actually look like real fur later. Another thing that I like to do is add some of these darker areas, like I'm doing now, in between these clumps of fur, if you will, to make it look like some of these hairs are grouped into slightly larger clumps, and also to give a little more depth to that fur. So by adding some of these darker areas, I'm actually making it look like some parts of that fur are sticking outwards and are getting more light, while others are deeper inside that fur coat. And that kind of helps me achieve more of a three-dimensional look and more of a depth in the animal's fur. But there's going to be a lot of work done here. As you can see, now I'm moving on with a pencil eraser. So you see, once I've established the basic texture and some kind of a base tone, I added some darker areas, and then I start adding some lighter areas or highlights on top. So what are these for? Well, as I've already explained, it's all about increasing the illusion of depth on your animal's fur, and you do that by increasing the range of value. So by drawing these lighter hairs on top of the darker ones, we're making it look like some of those hairs or some of those clumps of hair are sticking out and are getting more light from wherever the light source is coming from. And this is often a back and forth process, because I will often not be happy with the way a certain area looks, and then I will simply go over it a few more times just to make sure that I've achieved enough depth and also that I got my values right. The good thing about these pencil erasers is that you can sharpen them and you can hold them kind of like a pencil, but the ones that I have gotten pretty short. They're usually quite a bit longer and more convenient, but it still works pretty well. So these are Koh-i-Noor pencil erasers. Let me just say a few words about shading. I zoomed in a little bit because I'm going to be working around the eye now, and I want you to see a bit more of the detail. By the way, I'm using a Warrison woodless charcoal pencil, and I use these mostly because woodless charcoal pencils are easier to sharpen. The one that I have is also a bit shorter, that's why I'm using this pencil holder. So let me just say a few general words about shading, because I already talked about drawing fur and things like that. One of the ways you can approach shading when you have a large animal is you can place the larger areas of darker value first. Why is this useful? Because you don't want to get caught up in the details too much, because if you only worry about the texture of the fur and the appearance of the fur, it can happen that your subject ends up looking flat. Now here in this particular drawing, I tend to break that rule most of the time, because most of the time I work just by laying down this fur texture. But that's because I already sort of know in advance where I'm going to have to use more value and where I'm going to have to take away a little bit of the value using erasers. If you are struggling with that, if you have a problem with that, a good solution is to make a short break every now and then when you're drawing furry animals, and kind of step back and take a look at your drawing and try to make sure that it doesn't look flat. You want to make sure that you have a sufficient amount of contrast, because what will often happen, and that also happened while I was doing this, when you step away from your drawing, it looks like a large gray area, and it's kind of difficult to discern some of the main parts. And when I see something like that, I always go back in, adding some more of these darker values, darkest values, pushing the range of value using a soft charcoal pencil, and also taking away a little bit of the value using a kneaded eraser and a pencil eraser. So what you want to achieve is larger contrasts, and you want to define the larger relationships so that the viewer can kind of immediately understand what they are looking at. That's what we're going for. Anyway, I used a bit of vine charcoal to establish some base tone here on the head and the area above the head, and then I started working on the texture of the fur. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of that. And let me get back to saying what I was already explaining about the drawing of the fur. By the way, here I used a little bit more of the vine charcoal to establish some more of these darker areas. When you draw the fur, like I said, you want to pay attention to the length of your strokes as well as the direction. But the thing is that if you don't want to make the fur look too artificial, you want to vary that direction just a little bit. So just to vary the angle of your strokes ever so slightly and kind of make them overlap a little bit. And that way, once you go over everything with a brush, everything will look a lot more convincing and a lot more realistic. Now, the reason why I use a brush for blending when I draw fur is because if I try to do this with the Tortillion tends to blend a little bit too much, and it tends to destroy most of that texture that you're trying to create. And these lines would all kind of get blended together a little bit too much. When you do that with a brush, that doesn't happen. So when you blend with a brush, most of those strokes still remain visible, and that's very important for me because I'm trying to create a realistic looking texture. So here, as you can see, I'm adding a little bit more value in the areas in between the head and the rest of the body. And I'm also trying to add some deeper shadows in between these individual clumps of hair on the head. I used a little bit of the soft charcoal pencil here on above the head. That was a soft charcoal pencil I used. If you're wondering what the difference is between the medium charcoal pencil I have and the soft charcoal pencil, well, the soft charcoal pencil is simply a little bit softer and also a little bit darker. So one of the things I like to do is I like to do most of the work with a medium charcoal pencil. I like to do most of the drawing process with a medium charcoal pencil and white charcoal. And then I like to add some touches of soft charcoal pencil here and there. Sometimes these are larger areas, but sometimes these areas are fairly small. But most of the time I like to use the soft charcoal pencil sparingly so that it will have a stronger effect. Because if you use too much of your darkest darks, you will still end up with something that kind of looks flat because everything will be dark. So what you want to do is create a nice range of value where most of it is some kind of a mid-tone, and then you have your lightest lights and your darkest darks used kind of sparingly. Now obviously that also depends on whatever it is that you're trying to draw. Some subjects, some scenes will simply have a little more contrast than others. Others will have a softer lighting, less contrast. So you need to adapt to that, but generally it's always a good idea to have a nice range of value and to reserve your darkest darks for the darkest portions, and to use them kind of sparingly so that they would really stand out and really add that extra dimension, extra depth to your drawing. So you can see now that the bear is starting to come along nicely, and I already did a lot of work on the fur, and now I'm shading the nose and the snout. Now the problem with these areas around the nose is that most animals tend to have a very, very short fur around the nose, and sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to try to render that type of texture, because normally when you draw fur you pull strokes with your pencil, but when you have such short fur it can get a little difficult to show such short fur. So one of the ways you can do that is using a combination of short strokes and just scribbling, holding your pencil sideways and allowing it to produce a rough texture just by dragging it across the paper, and that usually helps me achieve that appearance of very short fur. And of course I'll be working on top of that additionally with a bit of pencil eraser to create some highlights on top of that as well. And I'm going to be using the pencil eraser in pretty much the same manner that I use a charcoal pencil. So when you use a pencil eraser and you're drawing fur, you need to keep in mind the same rules that you need to keep in mind when you're drawing with a pencil. So you always have to try to match the length of your pencil strokes, to match the length of the fur with the length of your pencil strokes. And that goes when you're working with a pencil eraser or a kneaded eraser for that matter. I'm working on the right side of the head. This needs to be a little bit darker, but there's a little bit of light coming from behind the animal and naturally from above. So the area around the eyes and these cheeks, if you will, is going to be a little bit darker, and also here in the middle of the head where there is almost like a parting, where the hair grows to both sides. And I'm adding these darker areas in between to increase that depth of the fur, and blending everything with a brush and then adding a little more. I'm also trying to experiment using a bit of my charcoal pencils as well as vine charcoal to see what works best. Generally, when you use vine charcoal, you tend to produce softer but slightly larger lines, and now I'm adding a few more of these highlights using a pencil eraser. So you can see how much more of a 3D appearance the head and the fur is starting to get. Another thing that I want you to notice about the way that I drew the fur on the neck and on the upper part of the back, I actually softened that quite a bit more using brushes, and that's because I want I want the rest of the body to be slightly out of focus. I want the head to be in the focus, and that's why I used sharper lines and a little more contrast there, and also a bit more texture. So I'm kind of trying to draw the attention of the viewer to the head. And the ear is a little bit darker because it's facing away from the light source. So I'm just adding a bit more fur on the rest of the animal's body and spreading that around with a brush. Where the fur is a little bit lighter and softer, I use a piece of vine charcoal. Because I think that works a little bit better for that. And where I need slightly darker and stronger lines, I like to use charcoal pencils. Charcoal pencils are made out of compressed charcoal, and compressed charcoal is a little bit darker and it tends to stick to the surface of the paper a little bit more. Vine charcoal can be moved around more easily, and it allows you to create slightly softer transitions. So I am now using a pencil eraser to define the right side of the body, drawing some highlights on the fur because I want the fur to stand out against the dark background there. So I want a nice contrast. But at the same time I'm trying to blur these lines just a little bit. I'm not trying to produce very clean lines because I want the fur to appear slightly softer and fluffier. And the way you can achieve that effect is you can allow your pencil eraser to get a little bit dirty, and you just drag it across the paper, and that way when it already picks up a little bit of charcoal, it doesn't produce very clean lines, it doesn't produce very sharp contrast. And when you want to produce cleaner lines with a bit more contrast, then you clean the eraser and then you just erase away, creating these nice clean white lines which stand out a bit more. So in the part of the animal which is supposed to be in the focus, which is the head mostly and the snout, I'm going to be using a cleaner eraser and trying to achieve slightly more texture and a little bit more contrast, whereas with the rest of the body I'm trying to create that slightly out of focus look, and I'm trying to make the fur look fluffier and also a little bit longer as well. So back to what I was saying about the length of the strokes and the length of the fur. It's important to make sure that the length of your strokes reflect the length of the fur in that particular part of the body. And in this part of the body here around the back and the sides, the fur is a little bit longer. But also the thing is that because the head is slightly closer to us than the rest of the body, some of those hairs will also appear shorter and smaller because they're further away from the viewer. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind when you're drawing a complex subject like this. But some of the main things are what I've already mentioned: the direction of the fur, the length of the fur, and of course making sure that you don't get caught up in drawing all of these textures, and that you make sure that you have a nice contrast between the larger areas of lighter and darker value, because when you do that, then your subject is easily recognizable even from a distance, and I'm kind of hoping that I'm achieving that. That's why here and there I'm going back in, adding a little more value to some of these areas which are supposed to be darker. And I'm shading a little bit more around the nose, trying to make that darker as well, and some other areas around the eyes and on the head and above the head. And I also added a touch of that soft charcoal pencil in some of the darkest areas of the drawing, for example in the ears, around the eyes, and the shadow under the animal's head, under the snout. Now the bear will be resting its head on one of its paws, or actually both of the paws, and I thought that looked kind of cute. That's why I picked this picture. But right now I'm still trying to refine the snout a little bit, adding a bit more of these highlights using a pencil eraser and trying to create that appearance of very short fur. Now I'm trying to draw around the first paw, and it needs to be a little bit darker here, and I have to define these claws. But before I do that, I'm just going to add a little bit of value using vine charcoal. Now the other front leg and the other paw will be here, and I'm just going to shade the rest of the terrain using this vine charcoal just to make it a little bit darker and add a little bit of value. I'm going back in, making sure that some of these folds in the fur are dark enough, so I'm just adding a little bit more in between to make the lighter fur stand out, so that I can increase that range of value and increase that contrast, so that I can get more depth and volume out of my subject. And I'm doing most of the refining now with a piece of vine charcoal, but some of the areas where I need a little more precision are usually done with a charcoal pencil or a pencil eraser, depending on whether I need to create areas of lighter or darker value. So now I'm going to draw some fur on these paws, and I'm trying to imitate the appearance of fur here as well. Again, keeping in mind the length of the fur that needs to be rendered, and also adding some darker areas in between to give that fur a little more depth. But it's also another important thing for me is to define the darker areas in between these fingers, and to shade enough around these claws so that they would stand out, because they need to be lighter than the rest of the animal. So I'm just pulling some highlights on these claws, trying to make them stand out, and now I think I've achieved a decent amount of contrast. I kind of skipped over a part here where I finished the other paw, and now I'm shading the terrain. I lost a little bit of footage there, it got corrupted for some reason, but now I'm working on the terrain. And I want the ground to have a little bit of variation in terms of value. I just want to make it a little bit more interesting, but I'm also adding a bit of shadow under these paws and under the animal to make that part of the ground a little bit darker. So I just added a little bit of variation in terms of value and texture to the terrain, and now I'm going to start adding a little bit of detail to it as well. Because the bear is sleeping, this is probably winter or late fall, so I'm going to draw some fallen leaves and maybe a branch or a twig or two here and there, just to add a little bit more to the atmosphere, and also to make the whole scene and the ground a little more interesting. I'm adding a little bit of shadow under these leaves because I don't want to make them look like they're hanging in midair. I just I'm adding a bit of shadow to make them more three-dimensional, and also trying to define their shape a little bit. I'm just adding a few more details here and there, just a few lighter bits here and there, and maybe a few twigs just there on the ground. Nothing specific really, just a few details to make everything a little more interesting. And also I'm adding a little bit of variation to the ground, maybe trying to define some cracks in that ground and some raised areas, maybe a stone or two, who knows. I'm going to add a slightly larger twig here. Has fallen off maybe. It's lying there on the ground. And a little bit of shadow underneath. So the lower side is the shadow side. I want to make it look a little bit twisted and kind of irregular shape. The upper side, which is facing towards the light source, is going to be a bit lighter. I'm going to draw that with a pencil eraser to achieve nice contrast. I'm going to add a few more details to it so that it looks kind of more irregular and more like an actual tree branch or a twig, so that it doesn't look like a pipe. And this shadow underneath is also very important to give it more of a 3D look. And I'm just adding a little bit more texture and a few more details to the terrain. Just putting down some finishing touches. I'm going to add another leaf here on the right, maybe to make the whole scene a little bit more balanced. And cleaning up the edge around the twig. Just adding some lighter portions in the ground, maybe a few more details here and there. And here I'm just putting down some finishing touches, cleaning up some of the edges around the snout, and adding some of these flyaway hairs. The drawing is done. I'm going to sign it in the lower left corner, just a small signature, and that's it. That's my charcoal drawing of a sleepy bear. I hope you like this drawing. Don't forget to check out my other videos. Thank you for watching, and bye.